Today we're going to be taking a look at Funtoo, another Gentoo Linux spinoff. And hopefully this one is going to be a bit better than Clover OS with all of its glaring faults and nonsense. And as we can see right here on the funtoo.org website's homepage, Funtoo Linux is a community-developed Linux meta-distribution that is based on Gentoo Linux. Funtoo Linux is optimized for the best possible performance on the latest Intel and AMD hardware. And that actually sounds really good. I wonder if there's going to be some type of script that's built into the installation of Funtoo that automatically identifies your hardware, and maybe it LTOs it accordingly or applies graphite or some other settings like that. Actually, probably not, considering that that still breaks about 2/3 of the packages in Gentoo with the default use flags. But depending on how optimized this is, I might actually end up distro hopping to Funtoo, since I'm already trying to do the same thing myself with my Gentoo installation script. I guess we'll have to find out. So we can get started with the install by heading over to funtoo.org/install. Now, it should be noted that just like with Gentoo, you could install this from any live CD. You don't necessarily need the live CD that is included on the Funtoo website here, although it does come with all the necessary tools that you need to actually go ahead and build it. So since this is a guide, I'm going to use that same live CD anyway, which is the Area 31 Funtoo live CD. So you can get it from this link here, where you download and boot the live CD of your choice. You see it right here. And this actually comes with a modern kernel and a full graphical environment. So it's going to be really nice to have that during our installation. So go ahead and download that. And then once it's done, we can come on over to VirtualBox. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine. And if you're following along, you can do the same steps. I'm going to also make this an EFI virtual machine so that it's more similar to how you would do it on hardware if you're using a UEFI system. So for naming it in VirtualBox, you can just start typing Gentoo, and then it's automatically going to choose the correct type and the version, and then you can name it whatever you want. I'm going to make it 4 gigs in size and create the virtual hard disk as a fixed size, and I'm going to give it about 30 gigs of space. All right, and then just go into the settings to edit some other things. I'm going to give it 2 threads in my processor. I'm going to crank up that video memory, and that's right, enable EFI so that it functions more similarly to a UEFI BIOS. All right. And most important thing, of course, is we want to add the ISO to our virtual hard disk here. Funtoo live CD Area 31. And then we'll go ahead and start the virtual machine. All right, so this is the grub screen that we get when we first boot up Funtoo, and of course, you have the option here to start with a graphical environment. Of course, you could just boot into a regular TTY, just like you would when you were setting up Gentoo or Arch Linux, but this is Funtoo, right? So let's have fun. Let's go into a graphical environment. All right, so it looks like this is the first downside to Funtoo over Gentoo, is we don't have the little tuxes in the upper left-hand corner while OpenRC starts up. That is very unfortunate. All right, so you see the virtual machine that we have here. We've got a whole graphical environment. I want to see, though, if I can get a better resolution. I'm a little disappointed that it didn't automatically full screen for us. Let's see, what resolutions are available? Just as I thought. So we don't actually have a 16:9 aspect ratio here. I think this is using something like a 4:3, so unfortunately it's not going to be able to use up my full screen real estate. It looks like 1600 by 1200 is the closest that I can get though, since I have a 1920 by 1080 screen. So let's go ahead and do an xrandr. So now we have that bigger resolution. All right. And there's obviously a bunch of other tools that you saw we have to basically help us during the installation. Like we've got, probably the only other one I'll end up using is Firefox. But the first thing that we always have to do with these build-it-yourself distros is we have to go ahead and partition our disk. So let's just first do an lsblk so we can see what's going on. Of course, dev SDA is the disk that I'm going to be installing to. If you're doing a virtual machine as well, chances are yours will also be dev SDA. But if you're on actual hardware, especially if you have multiple disks, you want to make sure you install to the right one, because otherwise the steps we're about to cover are going to erase your data, and you don't want that. You don't want to lose all your precious data. All right, and let's actually zoom in a little bit, just so that we can see what we're doing a bit better. All right, so since we're going to be doing a GPT partition scheme, the command that we're going to use to start setting that up is gdisk, and then we're going to do that on dev SDA. And first we're going to use O to just wipe that partition, and we'll proceed with that. And then to create a new partition, you want to do N, and then give it a partition number. I'm just going to go in numeric order here. So number 1 partition will be 1. And just hit enter to use the first available sector as the beginning. And I'm going to make this 128 megabytes large. This is going to be for the UEFI partition. So just do 128 plus 128 M. And then you have to enter a hex code to let it know what type of partition it is. So the one for EFI, if you're doing an EFI boot partition, is EF00. If you don't believe me, then you can just use L to list the hex code, and then you can look through it yourself. But I usually don't mislead you guys, so it's pretty smart to just trust me. And then we're going to create our swap partition. So again, hit N to start doing a new partition, and then 2 to make it partition number 2, and enter to use the first available sector again, and then set it to the size that you want it to be. So I think I'm going to use 2 gigs for the swap partition, so we'll do plus 2G. And then the hex code for swap is 8200. And then finally, we'll create the root partition, and we'll just label it number 3. And then just hit enter to build it from the first sector, and then enter for the last sector. And once you know it, the hex code for a Linux file system is enter. So just smash that again, and you're all set. So now before writing, I would usually suggest that you print out your partition table just to make sure that you got everything right. So go ahead and hit P to do that. You can see the whole partition scheme that we use. So once you're sure that everything is good, you then want to hit W to write it, and then hit yes to proceed. And then that's going to bring you back to your shell prompt. So now it's time to create file systems on our partitions. So we're going to first do mkfs.vfat -F32 dev SDA1. So that's what you're going to do if you're using UEFI. If you're using MBR, then you probably want to do, I think it's ext2. So then we'll do that. And then to create swap on SDA2, we're going to do mk swap dev SDA2. And then, oh, right now our device is busy. Let's try that again. Okay, that's strange. Okay, that time it worked. Not quite sure what was going on there, but I just had to wait a couple of minutes until I was actually able to make swaps. So maybe you'll have to do that in your VM as well. Maybe you'll have to do that if you're on hardware. Let me know in the comments below if your swap, for whatever strange reason, your swap partition didn't allow you to make swap right away. But anyway, the next file system that we'll want to make is an ext4 file system on dev SDA3. So we're going to mkfs ext4 on dev SDA3. All right, so now we're going to have to make our folders that we're going to mount each of those partitions to, and then of course mount those partitions to the folder. So we're going to mkdir mnt funtoo. And okay, so that already exists. And then we'll mount dev SDA3 to mnt funtoo. And I wonder, do we already have mnt funtoo boot? Okay, so we don't have that one. Go ahead and make that directory. And then we're going to mount dev SDA1 to mount funtoo boot. And then we're going to also create mnt funtoo. Yeah, we don't have var yet, so we'll create that, and then mount dev. Wait, actually, that's my mistake. We don't actually have to do anything with var in this instance. If you're installing to a smaller disk or a slower disk, like if you have multiple disks in your system, then you could mount one of the faster disks to var, and that's just going to give you a slightly faster installation speed, but the whole thing is based off of a physical SSD, so I think I'll be all right with that. Anyway, it is now time to pick a stage 3, and this is where Funtoo actually becomes especially useful because we don't have to mess with links, we don't have to just curl or anything like that. We can actually just go right into a GUI browser like Firefox, and we can just go ahead and grab whichever stage 3 we want. And to get those, we want to head on over to funtoo.org/subarches. And this will basically give you a list of subarches. So these are all of the different processors that Funtoo Stage 3 has been optimized for. So you basically want to browse through this and find your specific architecture for the CPU you're going to be using. I'm using a Haswell, so I'm going to go on the Intel 64 Haswell. And this is where we have a couple of options. So I guess if you're learning disabled, you can pick this one over here to download it with a full GNOME environment, as well as Firefox already enabled, which honestly, if you actually want GNOME on Funtoo, then you should stop and get some help. Don't do something like this to yourself. I don't know if this is the Funtoo devs trying to be trolls by only offering the most crap desktop environment as a pre-built option or what, but it is a good meme if it is. Anyway, just go ahead and download the regular stage 3. We'll just save that. Go ahead and let that download. All right, so once that's done downloading, you then have to move it into place, because if you download it through Firefox, then it's going to be in your root downloads folder. So we can see that that's the stage 3 right there. And we want to move it into MNT Funtoo. So you could either do that with your file manager, or you could just do it from the terminal. I think it's easier to do it that way anyway. So then we want to cd into MNT Funtoo. And then we want to unpack the tarball with tar numeric owner -xpf, and then stage 3, whichever one that you ended up downloading. And this might take a few seconds to unpack, so I'm just going to pause the video to save some time while it does that. All right, so now it's going to be time to set up the churroot environment before we enter into it. So we're going to mount rbind sys to sys. I forgot to use a double hyphen there. Then also mount rbind dev to dev. And then we want to also copy over our resolve.conf so that we can make sure we have a working hostname resolution inside of the churroot. So cp etc resolve.conf over to mnt Funtoo etc. And then we'll churroot into the new environment. So it's envi home equals /root term in all caps equals $term, then churroot dot bash -l. That's churroot with 1t. Alrighty, and it's usually a good idea to just test your internet connection from here, because we're going to need a working internet connection to download the portage repository. So we'll ping whoever you want to ping. I'll just ping gnu.org. And we see it's working, so we're good there. All right, so now to download the portage repository, we want to install -d var get -o 250 g 250, and then ego sync. So this is going to copy a clone of the portage tree from GitHub, as well as all of the kits that need to go with it so that we can set everything up. Okay, and then we're going to edit our xcfs tab. And something that I really love about Funtoo is that we actually have access to VI within our churroot environment. So good on the Funtoo devs for including that. You don't have to use Nano if you don't want to, because I personally feel like VI is always better to use than Nano. And inside of this file here, there's a couple of things that we have to change. Well, actually, if you're using MBR, then all you really have to change in here is the label part. So that has to be dev SDA1, dev SDA2. Actually, I got that backwards. This one needs to be dev SDA3, because that's our root. And this one needs to be dev SDA2. All right, so we have that. And then if you're using UEFI, then you need to change this type over here because by default it makes it ext2, which like I said earlier, you're only going to be using ext2 if you're doing MBR. If you're doing UEFI, then you're going to be using VFAT. So there you go. That's the changes that we have to make there. Of course, you can always bring up another terminal and do an ls-blk to make sure that you actually have everything set accordingly. So it'd be a good idea to double check with that just to make sure that, again, you have everything set up the way that it's supposed to be. And once you're satisfied with it, go ahead and right quit to that file. And then we're going to set the local time. So the way we do that is ln sf, and then point that to user share or USR share zone info, and then whatever your local time is. Mine is Eastern Standard Time, so EST for me. And then let's update our environment. So we're going to emerge AU capital DN at world. Let's see, we failed to validate a sane dev. I wonder if, I probably do have to manually mount dev because I created the folder for it earlier. Okay, so we want to mount rbind dev. We'll do it to mnt funtoo dev. Okay, let's see if this works now, or do I have to restart the churroot? Okay, I think I have to restart my churroot. All right, so if the notes of your distro's install steps don't work, go to the notes of the distro which it is based off of. So in the notes about Funtoo in the installation guide, pretty much tells you that these are the only two file systems that you have to mount, or directories that you have to mount rather. But on the Gentoo churroot configuration, on that part of the AMD 64 handbook, it advises you to mount all of these. And then as you can see from this exited command here, that actually gets the emerge to work. So now we'll go ahead and run the emerge now that I actually have my churroot environment configured properly. But yeah, this is what you want to, in fact, I'll go ahead and zoom it in so you can see it a bit better. You want to go ahead and mount all of those respective directories before entering into the churroot environment, and then you can go ahead and do the emerge. And yes, I would like to merge these packages. So just a bit of a heads up, if anything in this Funtoo install guide doesn't seem right, I went ahead and decided to follow it because, well, it's the guide for the specific distro I'm testing out here. But if anything is off there, always refer to the Gentoo wiki. It is the superior guide. Once your system is up to date, it's a good idea to update the Linux firmware, especially if you're on hardware that has a Wi-Fi driver, because you often need newer firmware for newer hardware drivers to work. Or things like a graphics card as well. Usually the newer versions of the firmware works better for the graphics card. So we'll go ahead and echo sys kernel Debian sources binary to etc portage package.use. And then we'll emerge AV Debian sources. And of course, compiling our kernel can take a little while, so we'll go ahead and pause the video while that finishes up. Okay, my kernel is finished compiling, so now I'm going to install a bootloader. And for this video, I'm going to use grub. And I'm also going to install the Intel microcode for the bootloader since I'm using an Intel CPU. So we're going to emerge av grub Intel microcode and the iucode tool. Now, because I'm using uefi, I need to add grub as a uefi boot entry. So the commands to do that are mount o remount rw sys firmware efi vars, and then grub install target equals x6 underscore 64 efi directory equals bootloader ID equals Funtoo Linux grub recheck dev SDA. And this might actually complain because I don't think okay, never mind. Because I don't think I actually specifically named my boot entry, but it should be fine without that. All right, and then add the microcode to the grub config file, and then use the ego boot update. Yeah, so it had some difficulty finding the default kernel, so it's just using the first one. There's only one kernel that I'm using on here, so again, should be fine. So now we want to add DHCP to startup because it's nice to have DHCP. So that way you can automatically get your network configures detailed. So rc update, add DHCP CD default. And also if you were using Wi-Fi, it would be a good idea to add network manager here. That way you can actually connect to Wi-Fi networks a little bit easier. And I'm also going to change my host name so that it's not just localhost, which is the default. So we'll change this to Funtoo box. And now we just have to create a password for our root user. And it's also a good idea to create a standard non-root user to use on the system. So we'll go ahead and user add Kenny. And also you want to add that user to some necessary groups. So user mod G wheel audio portage, and then the user that you just created, and then create a password for your user. All right, so now if I did everything correctly, we should be able to exit this environment and then reboot into the actual virtual disk or hardware disk if you were installing this to hardware. So we'll just exit out of this chroot environment, unmount everything, and power off. All right, so I had to change my boot priority, so I would actually boot my hard disk first. All right, and then we have the login prompt. And here you go. So of course, we just did the regular standard stage 3. So from this point forward, you would basically configure your environment. You could pull down some type of a desktop environment like xfce if you wanted to use that, or if you wanted to go the window manager route, you could go that route. You would just need to configure Xorg and maybe a couple of other things to go with Xorg, like if you want multi-monitors, you'd want to use I forget which one it is, but it's one of those other packages that goes with Xorg that would allow you to have multi-monitors, and then you could then go ahead and compile i3 or DWM, whichever window manager you want to use. So maybe I'll make a video for how to do that, but I've already pretty much covered that, since the steps to do it are going to be the same whether you're using Arch Linux or Gentoo or Funtoo. Really, Gentoo and Funtoo would be the same, literally, since you're using the same package manager and everything like that. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave it a like, share it with those who are interested in trying Funtoo, share it with people who don't even know what Funtoo is, but they should know about it. And let me know what you thought in the comments below. Peace out.